Judge Margaret Thornfield woke up that Tuesday morning with the same routine she had followed for the past 15 years. Coffee at 6:30, morning news at 7, and in the courthouse by 8:15 sharp. She took pride in her punctuality and her reputation as one of the most efficient judges in the county. At 52, Margaret had seen it all: drug cases, domestic disputes, theft charges, and countless small claims court hearings. She had developed what she considered a keen ability to size up people the moment they walked into her courtroom. In her mind, this skill helped her manage her docket efficiently and keep the courthouse running smoothly. That morning, as she settled into her chair behind the massive oak bench, Margaret glanced at her computer screen to review the day's cases. The first case was a small claims dispute scheduled for 9 o'clock. The plaintiff was listed as Earl Jameson, occupation farmer. The defendant was Titan Industries Corporation, represented by their legal team. Margaret rolled her eyes slightly. She had handled dozens of these cases before. Usually they involved some minor disagreement over property lines, maybe someone's chickens wandering onto a neighbor's land, or disputes about shared water rights. These rural cases typically took no more than 30 minutes to resolve, and she expected this one would be no different. She had grown up in the city and attended law school at a prestigious university. Her career had taken her through high-profile law firms before she accepted her appointment to the bench. In her world, farming was something people did when they couldn't make it in more sophisticated professions. It wasn't that she looked down on farmers exactly, but she certainly didn't expect them to present complex legal arguments. The courtroom began filling up around 8:45. Margaret noticed there were more people than usual for a small claims case. She spotted what appeared to be reporters from the local newspaper, some residents she recognized from town council meetings, and several people in business suits who looked like they might be from the defendant company. At exactly 9 o'clock, the bailiff called the court to order. Margaret straightened her robes and prepared to get through what she assumed would be a quick morning session. She had a lunch meeting with the county commissioners at noon, and she wanted to wrap up this case with time to spare. The defendant's attorney, a sharp-dressed man with an expensive briefcase, took his place at the defendant's table. He looked confident, almost bored, as he shuffled through his papers. Margaret could see this was probably routine for him too. Then Earl Jameson walked in. The first thing Margaret noticed was his clothes. He wore a button-down shirt that was clean but clearly had seen many washings. His pants were pressed but showed signs of wear at the knees. His boots were polished, but they were definitely work boots, not dress shoes. He carried an old leather briefcase that looked like it might have belonged to his grandfather. Earl was a man in his early 60s with gray hair that was neatly combed, but looked like he had cut it himself. His hands were rough and calloused from years of physical work. When he walked, he moved with the deliberate pace of someone who had spent his life working outdoors. What struck Margaret most was how out of place he seemed in the formal courthouse setting. The fluorescent lights, marble floors, and imposing wooden furniture seemed to dwarf him. He looked around the courtroom with the expression of someone who rarely found himself in such surroundings. Earl approached the plaintiff's table and set down his briefcase with care. He pulled out a manila folder that was thick with papers, then looked up at the judge's bench. When their eyes met, he nodded respectfully. Margaret felt a familiar feeling wash over her. It was the same feeling she got when she knew she was about to deal with someone who was probably in over their head. She had seen it countless times before. Regular people who thought they could represent themselves in court, only to discover that the legal system was more complicated than they had imagined. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 9:05. She wanted to move things along quickly. The bailiff announced the case. Jameson versus Titan Industries Corporation, case number 2024 SC 1847. Margaret looked down at Earl, who was now standing behind the plaintiff's table. She noticed he was holding a small notebook and had several documents spread out in front of him. "Mr. Jameson," she said, her voice carrying the tone she typically used for pro se litigants, "you are representing yourself in this matter. Is that correct?" Earl nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, that's right." The moment he spoke, Margaret heard his accent. It was thick and distinctly rural, The kind of accent that immediately told you someone had spent their entire life in farming country. His pronunciation was different from what she was accustomed to hearing in her courtroom, and his grammar had the informal patterns of someone who had learned to speak from family and neighbors rather than from books and formal education. Margaret found herself fighting back a smile. The contrast between this simple farmer and the sophisticated corporate lawyer sitting at the defendant's table was almost comical. She wondered if Earl fully understood what he was getting himself into by taking on a large corporation without professional legal representation. The courtroom was quiet as everyone waited for the proceedings to begin. Margaret could sense the anticipation in the room, though she wasn't sure why this particular case seemed to have drawn so much attention. She looked at Earl again, taking in his nervous but determined expression. He was clearly trying to appear confident, but she could see the uncertainty in his eyes. This was probably the first time he had ever been in a courtroom, and he was about to go up against experienced corporate attorneys. Margaret felt a mixture of pity and mild amusement. She had no doubt that this case would be resolved quickly in favor of the corporation. In her experience, these David versus Goliath situations rarely ended well for David, especially when David was an uneducated farmer who probably had no idea what he was doing. Margaret leaned back in her chair and couldn't help but smile. The whole situation felt almost amusing to her. Here was this simple farmer, clearly nervous and out of his element, about to take on a major corporation. She had seen this story play out dozens of times before, and it always ended the same way. She glanced over at the defendant's table where 3 lawyers in expensive suits sat looking completely relaxed. One of them was actually checking his phone, probably already thinking about his next case. The lead attorney, a man named Harrison Blackwell from the city's most prestigious law firm, was casually flipping through what appeared to be a very thin file. His whole demeanor suggested this case was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Margaret turned her attention back to Earl, who was fumbling with his papers. She watched as he dropped a few documents and had to bend down to pick them up. When he straightened up, his face was slightly red from embarrassment. The whole scene reinforced her belief that this man was completely unprepared for what he was about to face. "Well, Mr. Jameson," Margaret said, drawing out his name in a way that made it sound almost quaint. "I suppose we should get this little farm dispute sorted out, shouldn't we?" The way she said, "little farm dispute," made several people in the courtroom shift uncomfortably in their seats. Her tone was the kind you might use when talking to a child about a scraped knee. It was patronizing in a way that was obvious to everyone present, but Margaret seemed oblivious to how she sounded. Earl looked up at her and nodded politely. "Yes, ma'am, I'd appreciate that very much." His voice was respectful, but Margaret could hear the nervousness underneath. She noticed how he kept glancing around the courtroom as if he wasn't quite sure where he should be looking or what he should be doing. Margaret's smile grew wider. She was enjoying this more than she probably should have. There was something almost entertaining about watching someone so clearly out of their depth try to navigate the complex world of legal proceedings. It reminded her of why she had worked so hard to get where she was, why she had spent years studying law and building her career. Behind Earl, in the gallery, she could see some of the local residents who had come to watch. A few of them were shaking their heads slightly, and she could tell they were embarrassed for him. Margaret felt a small surge of superiority. These people probably thought Earl was some kind of local hero for standing up to a big corporation, but they had no idea how the real world worked. "Please," Margaret said, gesturing with her hand in a dismissive way. "Enlighten us with your colorful version of events, Mr. Jameson." The word colorful was clearly meant to be a reference to his accent and his rural background. Margaret was essentially inviting the courtroom to join her in finding Earl's situation amusing. She wasn't being openly cruel, but her condescension was unmistakable. Earl cleared his throat and looked down at his notes. Margaret could see his hand shaking slightly as he tried to organize his papers. She wondered if he was beginning to realize that he was in over his head. Maybe he would just give up and accept whatever settlement the corporation was willing to offer. The corporate lawyers were barely paying attention. Harrison Blackwell was actually doodling on a legal pad, clearly not concerned about anything. Earl might have to say. His colleagues looked equally bored, as if they were just waiting for this whole thing to be over so they could get back to more important cases. Margaret looked at the clock again. 9:15. If she handled this efficiently, she could probably wrap up the case by 9:30 and move on to the next item on her docket. She had a reputation for running a tight courtroom, and she wasn't about to let some confused farmer slow down her schedule. She noticed that Earl had finally managed to organize his papers into some kind of order. He had separated them into different piles on the table in front of him, and he was now looking through what appeared to be a small notebook. Margaret assumed it was probably where he had written down some basic talking points, maybe with the help of a friend or family member who had convinced him he could handle this case on his own. The whole situation reminded Margaret of a story she had heard about a man who tried to perform surgery after watching medical shows on television. The confidence that came from not understanding the complexity of what you were attempting was almost admirable, if it wasn't so dangerous. Margaret decided to speed things along. "Mr. Jameson, whenever you're ready, please tell the court what this dispute is about." Earl looked up at her, took a deep breath, and nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor. I know this might seem like a simple case to you, but what happened to my land and my animals is anything but simple." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly at his phrasing. She hadn't expected him to acknowledge that she might see the case as simple. Most people in his position would just launch into their complaints without any awareness of how they appeared to the court. "Go on," she said, still maintaining her condescending tone but now with a hint of curiosity. Earl straightened up a little bit and looked directly at her. For a moment, his nervousness seemed to fade, and Margaret saw something in his eyes that she hadn't noticed before. It was determination, but it was also something else, something that made her realize that maybe she had been too quick to judge this man. But the moment passed quickly, and Margaret dismissed the feeling. She was probably just imagining things. After all, she had been doing this job for 15 years, and she knew how to read people. Earl Jameson was exactly what he appeared to be. A simple farmer who had gotten himself into a situation he couldn't handle. What Margaret didn't realize was that the next few minutes would completely change her understanding of not just this case, but of her own assumptions about the people who appeared in her courtroom. Earl Jameson was about to prove that sometimes the most dangerous mistake a judge can make is thinking they know everything about a person based on how they look and sound. The courtroom fell silent as everyone waited for Earl to begin his presentation. Margaret sat back in her chair, prepared to listen to what she expected would be a rambling, confused account of some minor property dispute. She had no idea that she was about to hear something that would stay with her for the rest of her career. Earl cleared his throat and stood up a little straighter. The nervousness that had been so obvious just moments before seemed to fade away, replaced by something Margaret couldn't quite identify. He looked down at his notes one more time, then looked directly at her. "Your Honor," Earl began, his accent still thick but his voice now steady and clear. "This case involves the defendant company illegally dumping industrial waste on my property, contaminating my water supply, and killing my livestock." Margaret blinked. Those weren't the words she had expected to hear. She had been prepared for a rambling story about fence lines or maybe a dispute over a shared driveway. Industrial waste dumping was a serious environmental crime, not the kind of minor issue she had assumed she was dealing with. Earl reached into his old leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of photographs. But these weren't the blurry snapshots, taken with a cheap camera that Margaret had expected. These were professional quality images, clearly labeled and organized. He laid them out on the table in front of him with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. These photographs document the contamination as it progressed over an 18-month period, Earl continued. You can see the progression, from the initial discharge to the complete destruction of the affected area. Margaret leaned forward slightly. The photographs were clear and detailed, showing what appeared to be a significant environmental disaster. Dead cattle, contaminated water sources, and acres of ruined farmland were documented with the kind of thoroughness she usually saw only in cases prepared by experienced attorneys. Harrison Blackwell, the lead attorney for Titan Industries, suddenly stopped doodling on his legal pad. His relaxed posture changed as he began paying closer attention to what Earl was saying. The other corporate lawyers also looked up from their phones and papers, their expressions shifting from bored confidence to cautious concern. Earl pulled out another folder, this one even thicker than the first. I have here chemical analysis reports from 3 independent laboratories showing dangerous levels of heavy metals, including lead, mercury, and cadmium, in my soil and water samples. Margaret's eyes widened. Independent laboratory reports were expensive and typically only obtained by people who understood the legal requirements for evidence in environmental cases. She had assumed Earl would have maybe a few pictures and some basic complaints. Instead, he was presenting the kind of evidence that could support a major lawsuit. The contamination began in March of last year when Titan Industries started their new manufacturing process at the facility, located 2 miles upstream from my property. Earl continued, now speaking with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was talking about. I have documented evidence that they knew their waste disposal methods were inadequate and would likely cause environmental damage. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even the reporters who had been quietly taking notes were now giving Earl their full attention. Margaret could feel the atmosphere in the room changing as people realized this wasn't the simple case they had expected. Earl reached into his briefcase again and pulled out what appeared to be a veterinary report. Dr. Patricia Williams, a veterinarian with 30 years of experience in livestock health, examined my cattle and determined that their deaths were directly caused by heavy metal poisoning, consistent with industrial waste exposure. Margaret felt her mouth go dry. A veterinary expert opinion was exactly the kind of evidence needed to prove causation in an environmental contamination case. Earl wasn't just making accusations. He was building a solid legal case with the kind of evidence that could stand up to scrutiny. Harrison Blackwell was now shuffling through his thin file with obvious concern. Margaret could see him whispering urgently to his colleagues, and their relaxed demeanor had completely disappeared. They were clearly realizing that they had seriously underestimated this case. Earl continued without pause. I also have correspondence from Titan Industries acknowledging that they were aware of problems with their waste disposal system. This letter, dated 6 months before the contamination began, shows that their own environmental consultants warned them about the risks. He held up the official-looking document with the Titan Industries letterhead clearly visible. Margaret could see it was a legitimate business letter, not something that could be easily dismissed or challenged. Furthermore, Earl said, now speaking with the rhythm and precision of a practiced attorney, I have documentation showing that Titan Industries has been cited by the Environmental Protection Agency for similar violations at 3 other locations. In the past 5 years, Margaret realized her mouth was hanging open slightly and she quickly closed it. Earl had just referenced EPA violations, which meant he understood federal environmental law and had done the research necessary to establish a pattern of behavior by the defendant company. The transformation was remarkable. The nervous, fumbling farmer who had walked into her courtroom 20 minutes earlier had somehow become a confident legal advocate, presenting a sophisticated environmental case. His accent was still there, but now it seemed less like a sign of his lack of education and more like simply the way he spoke. Earl pulled out yet another folder, this one bound with a rubber band. I have here sworn affidavits from 12 neighbors whose properties have also been affected by the contamination. They are prepared to testify about the damage to their land and the health problems their families have experienced. Margaret looked over at the corporate lawyers who were now in full crisis mode. They were passing notes back and forth and making urgent phone calls. Whatever they had expected when they walked into the courtroom that morning, it clearly wasn't this. Your Honor, Earl said, looking directly at Margaret, I know I might not sound like the kind of person who usually handles cases like this, but I've spent the last 2 years learning everything I could about environmental law. I've read hundreds of court cases, studied EPA regulations, and consulted with experts in the field. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She suddenly realized that her assumptions about Earl had been completely wrong. This wasn't some confused farmer who had stumbled into her courtroom. This was someone who had systematically prepared for this moment, someone who had educated himself and built a case that could potentially destroy a major corporation. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Everyone was staring at Earl with a mixture of shock and respect. Margaret could see that the reporters were now frantically taking notes, realizing they were witnessing something much bigger than a simple small claims case. Earl smiled slightly, the first time he had shown any confidence since entering the courtroom. "I may talk like a farmer, Your Honor, but I've learned that the law doesn't care how you sound. It only cares about the facts." Margaret felt like the ground beneath her was shifting. She had been so certain about who Earl was and what this case would be about. Now she found herself leaning forward, hanging on every word this man was saying. The transformation was so complete that she almost felt like she was watching a different person entirely. Earl reached into his briefcase once more and pulled out a thick document bound with a blue cover. Margaret recognized it immediately as a legal brief, the kind that typically took teams of lawyers weeks to prepare. The sight of it in Earl's weathered hands seemed almost impossible. "Your Honor, I've prepared a comprehensive legal brief outlining the environmental crimes committed by Titan Industries," Earl said, holding up the document. "This includes a detailed timeline of events, legal precedents from similar cases, and a complete analysis of the applicable federal and state environmental regulations." Harrison Blackwell shot to his feet. "Your Honor, we weren't informed that the plaintiff would be presenting such extensive documentation. We request a continuance to properly review these materials." Margaret looked at Harrison with surprise. This was the same lawyer who had been so relaxed just minutes earlier, the one who had been doodling during what he thought would be a simple hearing. Now he looked genuinely worried, even desperate. Earl turned to face Harrison with a calm expression. "Mr. Blackwell, I sent copies of all my evidence to your office 3 weeks ago by certified mail. I have the return receipts right here." He pulled out a small folder containing what were clearly postal receipts. "Your office signed for the delivery on October 15th. Margaret watched as Harrison's face went pale. She could see him frantically, whispering to his colleagues, and one of them was frantically searching through files on his laptop. It was obvious they had received Earl's materials, but had simply ignored them, assuming they weren't worth reviewing. Earl continued, as if nothing had happened. "As I was saying, Your Honor, this brief documents not only the environmental damage but also the pattern of corporate negligence that led to it. Titan Industries has a documented history of cutting corners on environmental safety to increase their profits." He opened the brief to a marked page. Page 47 shows EPA violation notices from their facility in Ohio, where they contaminated 3 family farms in an almost identical situation. Page 62 documents their facility in Tennessee, where they were fined $2.8 million for groundwater contamination. Margaret found herself taking notes, something she rarely did during small claims hearings. The level of detail and preparation Earl was demonstrating was extraordinary. She had presided over cases handled by some of the best lawyers in the state, and few of them had come to court with this level of documentation. Earl pulled out another folder, this one marked with colored tabs. "I've also prepared witness testimony from environmental scientists, agricultural experts, and public health officials. Dr. Robert Chen from the State University's Environmental Science Department has provided expert testimony about the long-term effects of this type of contamination." The mention of expert witnesses sent another wave of panic through the corporate legal team. Expert witnesses were expensive and time-consuming to prepare, and they were essential for proving complex environmental cases. The fact that Earl had managed to secure them showed a level of legal sophistication that none of them had anticipated. "Dr. Chen's analysis shows that the contamination will affect my land for at least 20 years, even with extensive remediation efforts," Earl continued. "The cost of cleaning up this environmental disaster is estimated at over $1.5 million. Margaret could hardly believe what she was hearing. Earl was presenting a case that would be impressive coming from a major law firm, complete, with expert witnesses, detailed financial analysis, and comprehensive legal research. His accent hadn't changed, and he still looked like the same farmer who had walked into her courtroom, but everything else about him had been completely transformed. Earl opened yet another folder. "I've also documented the health impacts on my family and my neighbors. My wife developed respiratory problems that our doctor directly links to the contaminated air from the waste site. My grandson, who used to play in our creek, has been diagnosed with elevated levels of heavy metals in his blood. The personal details hit Margaret harder than the legal arguments. This wasn't just about money or property damage. Real people were suffering because of what had happened, and Earl had methodically documented every aspect of that suffering. The medical bills alone have cost our family over $60,000, Earl said, pulling out a stack of medical records. And that's just the beginning. The doctors say we'll need ongoing treatment and monitoring for years to come. Margaret glanced over at the corporate lawyers who were now in full crisis mode. They were making phone calls, sending text messages, and frantically searching through their files. It was clear they had come to court completely unprepared for what they were facing. Earl seemed to notice the commotion, but remained focused on his presentation. Your Honor, I want to be clear about what I'm asking for. This isn't about getting rich or trying to take advantage of a big corporation. This is about making things right. He pulled out a detailed financial spreadsheet. I'm seeking $2.3 million in compensatory damages. This breaks down to $800,000 for lost livestock, $600,000 for crop losses over the next 5 years, $400,000 for land remediation, and $500,000 for medical expenses and ongoing health monitoring. Margaret was amazed by the precision of his calculations. Every number was backed up with documentation, receipts, and expert analysis. Earl had clearly spent months, maybe years, preparing this case with the thoroughness of a professional legal team. In addition, Earl continued, I'm seeking $5 million in punitive damages. This amount is based on similar cases where corporations have been held accountable for willful environmental destruction. He closed his folder and looked directly at Margaret. Your Honor, I know I don't look like the kind of person who usually handles cases like this. But when someone destroys your land, kills your animals, and threatens your family's health, you learn to do whatever it takes to fight back. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Margaret could feel the weight of everyone's attention as they waited to see how she would respond to this incredible transformation they had all witnessed. Margaret sat in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming in the background. She looked down at the notes she had been frantically taking, then back up at Earl, who stood calmly at his table waiting for her response. For the first time in her 15-year career as a judge, Margaret felt completely overwhelmed by shame, not just embarrassment or regret, but deep, crushing shame that made her stomach turn. She had spent the morning mocking this man, dismissing him as an ignorant farmer who didn't belong in her sophisticated courtroom. Instead, she had been faced with one of the most thoroughly prepared cases she had ever seen. Earl had presented a legal argument that was better researched and more professionally organized than most of the cases brought by the expensive law firms she dealt with every day. He had expert witnesses, scientific evidence, medical documentation, financial analysis, and legal precedents all perfectly organized and presented with the skill of someone who clearly understood exactly what he was doing. Margaret glanced over at Harrison Blackwell and his team of corporate lawyers. They looked like they had been hit by a truck. Their expensive suits and prestigious law degrees hadn't prepared them for facing someone like Earl. They had walked into the courtroom expecting to steamroll a confused farmer, and instead they had run headfirst into a legal brick wall. Harrison was frantically whispering with his colleagues, probably trying to figure out if there was any way to salvage their position. But Margaret could see the defeat in their eyes. Earl had built an airtight case that would be nearly impossible to challenge. The evidence was overwhelming. The legal arguments were sound, and the documentation was more complete than anything the corporate lawyers had brought to court. Margaret realized that everyone in the courtroom was watching her, waiting for her response. The reporters had stopped taking notes and were staring at her expectantly. The local residents who had come to support Earl were leaning forward in their seats. Even the bailiff was watching her with curiosity. She cleared her throat and tried to compose herself. As a judge, she was supposed to remain neutral and professional regardless of her personal feelings. But the magnitude of her mistake was so overwhelming that she struggled to find the right words. Mr. Jameson, she began, her voice much quieter than it had been at the beginning of the hearing. I need to address something before we proceed with this case. Earl nodded respectfully. Yes, Your Honor. Margaret took a deep breath. She had never done anything like what she was about to do, but she knew it was necessary. I owe you a sincere and public apology. When you walked into my courtroom this morning, I made assumptions about you based on your appearance and the way you speak. Those assumptions were completely wrong and entirely inappropriate. The courtroom remained silent, but Margaret could feel the tension in the air. Everyone was surprised to hear a judge admitting to such a fundamental mistake. Your presentation today has been exceptional, Margaret continued. The level of preparation, research, and legal understanding you've demonstrated is remarkable. I have rarely seen such thorough documentation and professional organization, even from experienced attorneys. Earl's expression softened slightly. Thank you, Your Honor. I appreciate you saying that. Margaret wasn't finished. She needed to say everything that was weighing on her heart. Mr. Jameson, you've taught me something important today about the danger of making judgments based on superficial impressions. I allowed my preconceptions to cloud my professional judgment, and that was wrong. She paused and looked around the courtroom. I want everyone here to understand that what happened this morning was a failure on my part, not yours. You came to this court seeking justice, and you deserve to be treated with respect from the moment you walked through that door. Earl nodded graciously. Your Honor, I appreciate your words, but I understand how things looked. I know I don't fit the usual picture of someone who handles complicated legal cases, but I learned a long time ago that how you talk doesn't determine how well you think or how hard you're willing to work. Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes. The dignity and grace Earl was showing in this moment made her feel even more ashamed of her earlier behavior. He had every right to be angry with her, but instead he was showing understanding and forgiveness. She wiped her eyes quickly and tried to regain her composure. Mr. Jameson, based on the evidence you've presented today, I'm prepared to rule in your favor. The documentation you've provided clearly demonstrates that Titan Industries engaged in illegal environmental practices that caused significant damage to your property and harm to your family. The courtroom erupted in quiet murmurs as people reacted to her announcement. Earl's face showed relief but not surprise. He had known his case was strong, and he had prepared for this moment. I'm awarding you the full amount you requested, Margaret continued. $2.3 million in compensatory damages and $5 million in punitive damages. Additionally, I'm ordering Titan Industries to immediately begin environmental remediation of the affected area under EPA supervision. Harrison Blackwell slumped in his chair. $7.3 million plus remediation costs would be a devastating blow to his corporate client. But given the evidence Earl had presented, there was no way to argue against the judgment. Margaret looked directly at Earl. Mr. Jameson, I want you to know that your case will stay with me for the rest of my career. You've reminded me why I became a judge in the first place, to ensure that everyone gets fair treatment under the law, regardless of how they look or sound. Earl smiled for the first time that day. Your Honor, I hope my case helps other people. Understand that justice isn't about fancy degrees or expensive suits. It's about being prepared, telling the truth, and never giving up when you know you're right. As the courtroom began to clear, Margaret remained seated, thinking about what had happened. A farmer with a thick accent and worn work boots had just taught her more about respect, preparation, and the true meaning of justice than all her years of legal education combined. She realized that she would never again make assumptions about the people who appeared in her courtroom. Earl Jameson had changed her forever, and she was grateful for it.